Welcome to Diversity Matters. This program is designed to highlight the diversity-related activities throughout New Hanover County Schools and the greater Wilmington region. I'm Caress Clegg, Community Relations Coordinator for New Hanover County Schools. This month, we are delving into Native American culture and heritage and taking a deeper look into the history of Native Americans. The history of slavery in the Americas and later the United States from 1619 to 1865 among African American people is of no secret. It is taught in our history books, recounted in our museums, and reimagined in films throughout Hollywood. But there is little spoken about the slavery of Native American people. Before 1700, more indigenous people were traded across North America than people of African ancestry. The slavery of Native Americans was vital in the expansion of colonies held by Spain, France, and England. So why is this history so unknown? Better yet, why is the history, culture, and heritage of Native Americans in general such an unknown factor? With my guest today, we will talk about the representation of Native Americans in our district and in our history books. This is going to be a very educational and informative edition of Diversity Matters, and I can't wait to hear from our guests. So don't go away. We'll be right back after this short break.
I'm a bus driver.
I'm a bus driver.
I'm a bus driver.
Wouldn't you like to be a bus driver too?
New Hanover County Schools is now hiring individuals to be a part of our elite core of school bus drivers.
That's right. You can work full-time, part-time, or serve as a substitute bus driver.
New Hanover County Schools offers competitive wages, flexible hours, and state benefits.
Best of all, you get to work with the greatest kids in the world.
We need you!
Contact us today to join the next free commercial driver's license class.
New Hanover County Schools is an equal opportunity employer.
Sometimes the things we do or say can make others feel hurt, excluded, or isolated. Everything you say and do creates an impact.
How am I supposed to save the whole world?
You can't think about saving the world. You have to think about saving one person.
Because of you, someone's entire life can change. You don't have to be a superhero to have a positive impact.
Friends?
Friends.
Welcome back to Diversity Matters. I'm Caress Clegg, filling in for Valita Quattlebaum, Chief Communication Officer for New Hanover County Schools. Today we're taking a look at Native American heritage and our school system. Joining us now is Mr. Locklear, New Hanover County Schools Principal of the Year. Thank you for being with us today, Mr. Locklear. A pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
So let's just start off. You are Principal of the Year. How does that feel? How does it feel being the first Native American Principal of the Year?
Obviously, I'm honored. Very humbling experience. I don't necessarily love the spotlight on me, but what I do appreciate about it is it has given me an opportunity and a platform to kind of share my story, my family story, some of our struggles, and our perspective on education.
Awesome. Talking about sharing your stories, I was told at the administrative retreat you had a very powerful and impactful speech, and you talked about your grandmother and how she was the Native American Medea. Care to share about your grandmother and her strength and tenacity and how that impacted your life?
Yeah, it's interesting because when people ask me who was sort of the toughest person I know, it was my grandmother. And she was sort of ahead of her time. She was born in 1904, so basically she was 15 years old when the First Amendment giving women, or the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote was passed, and she was very outspoken and confident, which was not the norm in her time. But what I think she did was I learned a lot of resiliency from her. I learned a lot of self-confidence. And one of the biggest takeaways from my grandmother is she was a tremendous storyteller. And so she cultivated this love of history for me, and sort of why I became a history teacher.
Awesome, awesome. So tell us about some of the stories she would tell you.
Well, a short one that was really kind of neat is that back before the early part of the century, when a family member died, they would have the wake in the home. And they would call it setting up because they literally set up with the body all night, the night before the funeral. And so they had a family member who died, and she smoked a corncob pipe. And my grandmother had two really mischievous teenage cousins who liked to play pranks. So about 2 or 3 in the morning, when everyone had fallen asleep in the room with the body, they decided that they would prop her body up in the coffin, put her cob pipe in her mouth, light the cob pipe, and then wake everybody up for the fun of it. And needless to say, they got quite a reaction. Everybody cleared the room.
I imagine.
You know, pranks have been going on for a while.
Awesome. Good to hear. Funny story. Is there any significant heritage origin to your name?
So my last name, Locklear, is pretty much the most predominant Lumbee name in the Lumbee tribe. And just to kind of give you an example of that, of my 4 grandparents, 3 of them, their last name was Locklear, 3 of the 4. And so there has been some evidence that Locklear may have been a Tuscarora phrase that meant hold fast. I don't know how much historical validity there is to that, but pretty much if you hear the last name Locklear, there is some connection in some way to the Lumbee tribe in southeastern North Carolina.
Are there any famous people you can think of mine who have that last name?
Yes, so actually the actress Heather Locklear.
90210, is that?
Yes.
Okay. Or Melrose Place.
Miller's Place.
Yeah.
Her grandfather's from Lumberton.
Oh.
He's a Locklear. Sean Locklear's from Lumberton. He was NFL football player for the Redskins and the Seahawks. Gene Locklear was a professional baseball player in the 70s and then became an artist, pretty famous artist. So there are a few.
Oh, cool. How has being Native American impacted your career?
I think that being Native American has given me a unique perspective on educational, political, social issues. The biggest thing I think, because I've not really worked in a community where there's a large concentration of Native American students, it's allowed me to identify with a lot of different groups. Personally, you know, my father lived during the Jim Crow era, segregation, went to segregated schools, you know, segregation in restaurants and so forth. So I think having that family experience has allowed me to identify with other groups who've had those similar experiences.
You say you haven't really taught in a dominant Native American school or population, but when you were raised and went to school, did you just go to school to a Native American school, or?
I did not. Well, schools have been integrated. We have one county high school. I would say that Native American students were maybe 10 to no more than 20% of the population.
Gotcha.
My father, however, grades 1 through 8 went to a Native American school. Growing up, I went to a Native American church, predominantly Native American, lived in a predominantly Native American community.
Gotcha. How do you deal with issues of racism at school, and were you ever the subject of any racism growing up?
You know, fortunately for us, I haven't seen with our student population a lot of overt racism, but because one of the things we do at Rowe is every day we have a social emotional learning period. So we focus on accepting others, getting along with others, proper social interaction. So we really try to build on those skills that will benefit them in all social situations. That would include interacting with people from different cultures and races and backgrounds.
Gotcha. And then the second part, did you deal with any racism growing up yourself as a kid?
I would say it was it wasn't overt. I was a good student. I was successful in school. But I do think in the community I grew up in, if you were from, I grew up in a community called Hasty. If you were Hasty, if you were from Hastings and your last name was Locklear, then you were Native American, and so there was some connotation with that.
Gotcha.
But for the most part, I didn't see a lot of overt racism, but I do think there was some more subversive undertones in some situations.
Gotcha. So we've been talking about representation, and the district's is going big on equity and making sure we have equal representation among our, not just our students, but among our district leaders and teachers. Do you think the district does a good job of recruiting and retaining minority educators?
I think that that's a challenge nationwide. First of all, your pool for teachers, minority teachers, is small. And a lot of times minority teachers will seek to work in larger school systems. So for example, here in North Carolina, Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, Greensboro. And so it's a challenge. I can say that on a personal level, I've tried to make that an emphasis at Rowe. About 1/3 of our total staff is minority. And then when you just look at certified staff, about 1/3 of our staff is minority of certified staff. I think one thing we can do as a district is focus on not just looking at one minority group population, say African American teachers, but looking at Native American, Hispanic, Asian, because we can benefit from that diversity, and one minority group in a lot of ways can relate to all minority groups.
That is very true. Well, Mr. Locklear, I do appreciate you coming on and speaking with us today. It has certainly been enlightening getting the Native American heritage and personal background this morning with Mr. Locklear. When we return, District Social Studies lead teacher Travis Matthews will join us as we speak with both educators regarding Native American history in our textbooks and the classrooms.
As farmers and ranchers, stewardship of the land comes naturally. You leave it better than you found it, so future generations can enjoy a way of life that you love. Thanks to your efforts, we're fortunate to experience clean water, abundant wildlife, and healthy rural communities. Your work is vital, and its benefits extend far beyond your property, reaching millions of other Americans who depend on this region every day without even realizing it. You take care of the land because it's the right thing to do. But did you know that conservation can also improve your bottom line? Take a moment and find out how conservation pays. Visit conservationpays.org.
Welcome back to Diversity Matters. Joining us now, we have New Hanover County Schools Principal of the Year, Glenn Locklear, and Travis Matthews, Lead Social Studies Teacher. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us here today. Glad to have you. First off, I just want to talk about what Native American history looked like for you guys when you were in school. What do you remember learning?
Well, to be honest, I had a very limited learning experience about Native Americans. I was told, and we did talk about the fact that colonists had taken land and these types of things, but as far as getting into Native American culture and other aspects, it was very limited.
How about you, Mr. Locklear?
I think for me, growing up in the 70s and 80s, it was very generic. So there was a lot of talk of, during Native American Heritage Month, maybe Sitting Bull and Geronimo and the Sioux and Wounded Knee, but very little information that was pertinent to Native American groups on the East Coast and in North Carolina in particular.
And where did each of you go to school at? I know you said you're from Laurinburg, North Carolina, so that's here in the state. What about you, Travis?
I went to North Iredell High School in Statesville, North Carolina.
Okay, so both North Carolina educations and just didn't get that in-depth learning of Native Americans.
Correct.
Correct.
How about when you look at your collegiate experience? What was it like there? Because I know, Mr. Matthews, you specifically are a history buff. So was there a strong teaching of Native American history in college for you?
Right, I think actually we're both history majors.
Oh, okay.
Right.
I didn't realize that.
So-
All three of us are history majors then.
Okay, okay,
I too
awesome.
majored in
I didn't
history.
realize that.
Yeah, UNCW.
Okay, nice. Okay, honestly, I didn't get a much more in-depth college experience either, and partly I think there were some Native American history courses offered. I didn't enroll in any of those.
And I was a social studies education major, so that encompassed not just history, but economics and geography, and there was really no Native American history or culture. I think I started to explore more of my own history through a class when I was at UNC Chapel Hill, White Culture and Race Relations in the South, and that sort of spurred some of my own research into my personal family history.
And I'll just mention for myself, I just graduated in '09 from UNCW, so not that long ago. And it was still, there weren't, I don't even remember Native American classes that were being taught for me to sign up for. I mean, my history point of view was kind of more taken from the African American aspect is what I specialized in history. But even then, looking at anything other than generic American history or African American history, there wasn't a lot related to it.
And I know that since I've graduated now, you know, they've got a Native American Studies program at UNC Pembroke. They have a Native American Studies program at UNC Chapel Hill. So those are things that weren't around when I was in college 25 years ago.
Right, and they do have a Native American expert on staff at UNCW History Department as well.
Good to know. So how is Native American culture and heritage taught in our schools today? What is it looking like? Is it in our history books? Are we seeing a push in it in K through 12?
I think we're much more educated and open today about Native American culture, their perspective, their achievements, and also some of the tragedies that occurred.
I can say that last year at Rowe, our U.S. history teacher asked me to come in and do a segment on Native Americans, and particularly I went in and talked about the Lumbee tribe, which I'm a member of. So I think it probably depends on the teacher and the emphasis in the classroom as well.
Mr. Matthews, for you, does the NC Social Studies cover Native American enslavement?
Yes and no. Our standards are very broad. I would say it's implied, not specifically mentioned, but that's the case for a lot of different topics, with our standards. Okay, they're just more thematic, concept-based. But again, it is there. It's one of the key things is just getting out information, to our teachers about it.
Okay. What suggestions do you have, Mr. Locklear, for Native American students in New Hanover County schools who may feel isolated and disconnected?
I think that's a challenge for a lot of Native Americans, and one reason why a lot of Native Americans don't leave their traditional communities, because they are outside of that comfort zone. For me personally, having 2 children that are Native American, they know the other Native American students in their school, so learning who you can identify with. And then I think a big thing that a lot of kids don't do these days is talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents about your heritage, develop that pride and be proud of who you are, and then educate those around you. Become a resource for folks in your school and your community about your heritage and culture and history.
Gotcha. Why do you think that the history of Native Americans is not as prevalent in our history books as the history of other groups?
Well, I think from the simple fact that in the United States today, nationwide, Native Americans are about 1% to 2% of the total population. And then that population is very isolated in certain pockets of the country. And because in most of the country, people don't even think Native Americans exist anymore, or maybe on a reservation out west, that you just don't get that attention because it's such a small minority in our country.
How about you, Mr. Matthews? What's your take on?
I think he nailed it. I really do. I think that sums it up.
I was thinking about it, and when you're looking at our history books or any history book, and how history is it's written by the victors, so you get kind of these historical outlooks and perspectives by those who won or those who were victorious. And so when you have such a European colonized countries such as North America, such as the United States. You kind of see that, look, where your history books show that point of view.
Right.
So, Mr. Locklear, we have Columbus Day coming up, and I know there's been a lot of push with Columbus Day and how there's not wanting to celebrate it. What is the impact that the celebration of that day has to people within the Native American community?
Well, you know, it's also Indigenous Day now, not just Columbus Day. But I think for at least Native Americans in the community that I grew up in, I think there's a lot of conflict. Because on one hand, you want to be a proud American, you want to be proud of your country, you want to be a good citizen, and at the same time, you wanted to acknowledge what occurred with your ancestors, that this was, that this land wasn't discovered, that it was already inhabited with a people who had a culture and a lifestyle, and then the atrocities that occurred during colonization, which started with Columbus. So I think the biggest thing is to have an open dialogue, and that we as a nation be honest and accept what occurred and do the best we can to kind of heal those wounds.
How can we better support and help our educators be inclusive in regards to Native American teachings in our classrooms?
Well, I think one of the things is, again, just letting people know and educating everyone as much as possible. You know, we're looking here the next year or so to do a book study on Native American enslavement, but also we've got a history lab that NHCS has created about Thanksgiving, looking at it from the Native American perspective and asking students to reflect on that.
What about you, Mr. Locklear?
I think that if we would focus more on Native Americans in North Carolina, within a 2-hour radius of Wilmington, you have 3 tribes. You have the Waccamaw-Siouan, less than an hour away. You have the Lumbee, you have the Coharie. And I think if we focus on the southeast United States, where all 3 of those tribes are located, and we look at Native American contributions throughout history, instead of just during Columbian and pre-Columbian times and during colonial times, but we look at the impact of Native Americans during the Civil War, a huge impact with Lumbee, during the Civil Rights Movement, during the Jim Crow era, that we kind of look at Native Americans as a group throughout the span of history, not just relegated to a certain period in time.
It's interesting you say that, because you said Jim Crow, civil rights. And when I think of those, I've never associated Native Americans with those specific movements. So knowing that they have an aspect and played a role in those times and periods of our history is important to teach and learn. Good. Can you tell us a little bit about the indigenous enslavement of Native Americans?
So, you know, we think of enslavement, we think of colonial times up to the Civil War, but for my tribe, the Lumbee, really enslavement occurred during the Civil War. In fact, it occurred here in Wilmington at Fort Fisher. So Native American men were required to come work in salt mines here along the coast, and also to build fortifications at Fort Fisher. In fact, I have a letter that a relative of mine back in the mid-1860s wrote to Governor Zebulon Vance, where basically he complained about the fact that he was being removed from his home in the middle of the night, forced to work in salt mines for the Confederacy. And because of this, he was unable to feed his family. And this sort of conscripted labor that was forced upon the Native Americans at the time led to the creation of the only outlaw east of the Mississippi, Henry Berry Lowry, and his Lowry gang. And they basically waged a war against the Confederacy from the middle of the Civil War through early Reconstruction. And it was based on essentially the Native Americans being enslaved and being victimized during the Civil War by the Confederacy.
interesting to know. I'm glad you shared that with us. All of this has been very informative, and I thank you both for coming on the show. The culture, heritage, and history of Native Americans is so rich and poignant, it must never be forgotten. Thank you to Mr. Locklear and Mr. Matthews for reminding us of that today. I'd like to thank my guests for being with us today. New Hanover County Schools is working to improve equity and diversity-related issues in all facets of the district. That's why we work to highlight diversity on our show. You're welcome to call the New Hanover County Schools Public Relations Department at 910-254-4245 if you have any questions or if you have a story idea for a future edition of Diversity Matters. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next month with an all-new edition of Diversity Matters.